Russell Brand recently posted a video on X talking about his change of heart towards Jesus, which led a lot of people to suspect that he's truly nearing a Christian conversion. But what's so fascinating about this is that Russell has gone from seeking God through pleasure to, ironically, starting to find God through pain. Let's talk about it. Now, in order to fully appreciate just how drastic of a shift this has been, you first need to understand Russell's religious views over the last several years. In the past, Russell's made it clear that he saw all religions as equally valuable.
Whether or not you identify as a Christian, for me that's not where I go with religion. Find a way of relating to divinity, to the divine. Create your own religion.
Russell not only saw everyone as quote-unquote God.
I believe God to be the limitless consciousness, of which my own tiny little consciousness is but a part. That my belief is that consciousness itself is one. If we're all one, we might as well be nice to each other.
He's also taken a classical Eastern view of believing that the physical world is just an illusion.
But remember, of course, that the material world is an illusion.
And it's because of this that Russell concluded that suffering is just an illusion that only exists in your mind. This is why in the past, whenever he explained how to deal with suffering, his answers have always been a variation of just changing your perception.
How I handle hard times. How do you handle hard times? This is a trick of perception. Often when I am sad or unhappy, I try to bring my focus to the many things I have to be grateful for. This is a trick of perception long practiced.
To better understand how his view of the world tied with his view of perception, think about when you were young and you thought that there was a monster under your bed. At that time, you had a perception of the world that included monsters living underneath your bed, and because of that, you couldn't sleep at night and you suffered from the fear of something that wasn't real. But maybe your parents gave you a teddy bear that they told you would keep you safe. Once you started to believe in the powers of the teddy bear, then you were able to change your perception and your fear of monsters could no longer cause you to suffer. The reason why your changing perception solved the problem was because your perception was the cause of the problem. So therefore, when you changed your perception, you got rid of the problem. Now, if you can understand that analogy, then you can understand how Russell viewed the entire world. He's basically saying that if you realize the thing that causes your suffering is an illusion, then you can change your perception of the problem. You decided to go from one illusion to another. And if you change your perception, then you get rid of the problem. And this view of the world seemed to be working really well for Russell. It helped him with his recovery and countless other things. Well, that was until the recent allegations against them surfaced more recently.
Police say they're investigating allegations of sexual offences following claims made against the comedian Russell Brand.
Describing these allegations against Russell Brand as being very serious.
They said that they have received a number of allegations of sexual offences.
A woman who has accused British comedian and presenter Russell Brand of sexual misconduct has described his response to the allegations as insulting.
There are more allegations that have come in following those reported ones.
Although Russell used to be an actor and a comedian, he's since shifted over to being a full-time YouTuber. But after these allegations came out, he was demonetized on YouTube, losing a significant portion of his income as well as a stained reputation. Now, whether or not you think he's innocent or guilty is really beside the point, because for the purpose of this video, all you need to know is that he seemed to be internally suffering as a result of these allegations, which has pushed him towards God. On his old view, he would have to just shift his perception by telling himself that the thing that's causing his suffering isn't real, and therefore he wouldn't have to feel the consequences of these allegations. But that would seem to be incredibly difficult given the fact that changing perception won't fix his public reputation, and it won't bring back his primary source of income. And this is where his old worldview really started to break down, which ultimately leads us to where he is today. In a recent clip, he no longer seems to see all religions as equally valuable for him, but instead, he seems to be narrowing down on Christianity. And listen to his reasoning as to why.
The reason I wear a cross is because Christianity, and in particular the figure of Christ, are, it seems to me, inevitably becoming more important as I become more familiar with suffering, purpose, self, and not self.
We'll pause right there for a second, but I hope that all of this is starting to make more sense. If he's starting to believe that his suffering is real, he's currently wrestling with how to make sense of his suffering, which has led him to be drawn to Christianity and its unique explanation for suffering. This would also explain why he's now reading the Bible and other Christian books which directly deal with the Christian understanding of suffering.
Reading the Bible a lot more, and as I've told you before, I'm reading Rick Warren's Purpose-Driven Life.
He also posted to his Instagram page that he's now reading C.S. Lewis's book, The Problem of Pain, where Lewis doesn't offer readers a way to eliminate suffering, but instead a way to understand its existence and its purpose in our spiritual growth. So if you notice, none of the books that Russell's been reading talk about suffering as an illusion. Instead, they all claim that suffering is real, which not only validates Russell's experience with suffering, but it also shows how to process and make sense of it. So now with that in mind, listen to the rest of the clip where he talks about how Christianity is now relevant to his life.
When I grew up, Christianity seemed like it was either really irrelevant and old-fashioned and sort of dusty and sort of incense and sort of Honor Domine, or they tried to modernise it and it seems just like, right, okay, we're going to talk about Jesus. And like both of those routes seem like, I don't know if there's anything for me. And I suppose it takes a certain amount of adulthood, and it might be different for all of us. For me, it seems that it's taken quite a lot to recognise that I need a personal relationship with God. It occurred to me that if instead of always talking to myself inwardly, I could replace one of those voices with an indwelling God. It says in Galatians, it is our job to die so that as Christ died on the cross, he might be reborn in us.
Now, this is a dramatic shift from where he came from. On his old view, Christianity couldn't be relevant to him while he was suffering because he seemed to only be interested in views that gave him ways to eliminate suffering. But once he realized that suffering was real and something that couldn't be ignored, he started to look for a way to make sense of it. And this is precisely why Russell seems to be drawn to Christianity as opposed to other religions. Christianity doesn't try to deny the existence of suffering. In fact, it doesn't even give you ways to avoid suffering. Instead, it gives you something much greater, a meaning and a purpose for your suffering. Romans 8:28 says that God causes all things to work together for the good of those who love God, to those who are called according to his purpose. And so when it comes to our suffering having a greater meaning, we see this best expressed in God himself. In Christianity, the greatest act of suffering took place when God put on human flesh, came into our world, and because he loved us, he chose to willingly suffer for the things that we freely chose to do wrong. It's in this way that we can see that God uses suffering for the greater good, even if we can't see or understand it at the time. And here we see an example of just that. One way that God can get our attention is through suffering, so that way it can bring those of us that are like Russell to a place where we seek and find him, and then by believing in him, we can be with God forever in a place where suffering is ultimately eliminated for all of eternity. So with all that being said, it sounds like God is really working in Russell's life. So make sure we all keep him in prayer. And if you want to see more of what was wrong with Russell's older view, go ahead and click this video to see what I mean. But the next time you find yourself wanting to eliminate suffering without stopping to consider that there could be a greater good, what are you gonna say? What do you mean?